Good evening, everyone. You are the largest audience I've ever spoken to, so I hope you're all sitting comfortably, but not too comfortable. And I will take you through a year at my favourite nature reserve. So here we are, hovering above the river mouth at Rye Harbour, looking at the wetland. And it's a fabulous place for people and for wildlife throughout the year. It's one of 32 nature reserves managed by the Sussex Wildlife Trust, and it totals 2,000 hectares. And we're, as Michael said, we're right over here in the east of the county. We're the last nature reserve before Kent. And the reserve is made up of two parts. There's the southern area, surrounded in red there, which is all about shingle and salt water. And in the north, it's about older shingle and freshwater. And there's a huge variety of habitats, and it's a fabulous place for wildlife. So in trying to summarize it very briefly, it was established as a local nature reserve over 50 years ago. We manage 600 football pitches for wildlife, and there's just 3 of us that do that here. It's got these other designations of a site of special scientific interest, a special protection area, a special area of conservation, and a Ramsar international wetland. Lots of species, many rare ones, over 300. And there's lots of facilities for visitors, footpaths and 5 bird watching hides. Sadly, none of our bird watching hides are open at the moment, but they will be soon. So here's the northern part, Castle Water and Castle Farm. And there's a few footpaths to explore around the northern side. But on the southern part, there's many more opportunities to, when you visit, to make your own circular route. You can spend all day here, or all year, or 30 years. And the principal reason as a nature reserve at Rye Harbour is because the Environment Agency manage the shingle to maintain the sea defences. And this recycling of the shingle keeps the harbour open for navigation, and it protects the pet sea wall. And the habitats on the nature reserve are 5 broad categories. Top left, there's the reed bed habitat. Top right, it's coastal grazing marsh with ponds and scrapes. And then there's salt marsh and saline lagoons. And the star habitat, the rarest nationally and globally, is vegetated shingle. So Rye Harbour's working year has got lots of things to do, all very tedious, and I'm not going to spend any time talking about it. I'm sure what you want to hear about is the wildlife year. So most of our wildlife is with us all year round, but we can't see it. Most of it is tiny. It's very good at hiding, and much of it is too difficult to identify. And we need the help of experts. And over the years, many people have contributed to recording the wildlife here. And here's a long list of species. This is our league table of species. And at the top, the beetles win easily. So 4,355 species at the last count. And over the years, we've had some really exciting finds here. Here's a fly that bears my name, and I'm indebted to 2 experts, Dr. Patrick Roper and Dr. Henry Disney, who helped identify this species new to science 20 years ago. More recently, there's been the discovery and the study of the 3rd pipistrelle species, the Nothusius pipistrelle bat. And without the help of Sally Ann Hurry and Roger Jones, we wouldn't know the exciting story of these bats. So the harbour's wildlife is hidden. Most of it is with us all year round, but it's only obvious for part of the year. So least lettuce, many of them will be just seeds at the moment, impossible to find. The leaves of frogbit will have all withered and there'll just be the corms, the roots that have sunk to the bottom of the ponds and ditches. The solitary bees will all be tucked up, hiding in their tunnels, and things like the willow gall, bean gall wasp are impossible to find at this time of year. So most species are seasonal. This is one of our very rare insects, one of 300. This is a weevil. It's only 3 millimeters long, and it's only known from 2 UK sites. But we know the best time to look for it is in June. So Rye Harbour has its seasons, and for convenience, I always refer to winter as being December, January, February, and so on. Of course, for those of you that are sat in the middle of the night in the Southern Hemisphere watching this, these seasons do not apply to you. So what causes the seasons? Obviously, the sun's involved, but it's also about the Earth's orbit and the Earth's tilt. If it wasn't for the fact that the Earth is tilted by 23 degrees, we wouldn't have seasons. And we sit quite a long way up the globe, more than halfway up from the equator towards the poles. So our seasons are very distinct. So here we go. Here's December over here. This is the Earth orbiting the sun, and only a month ago we had 8 hours of sunshine, just 8. When we get over to the middle of June, we'll be having 16. So where are we now? Here we are, January the 28th. We've already got an hour extra sunlight, and when it's not cloudy, the sun has got some warmth in it. So here we are drifting around the sun, and every species has got a very different strategy to exploit the seasons, to feed and grow and reproduce and survive. And this is, to me, it's the wonder of nature and why it's so endlessly fascinating. The study of this seasonal change is called phenology, and I've put here 2 graphs. They're out of our new report that on the vertebrates of Rye Harbour, which is available as a free download at the end of this the talk. I'm sure you're all as fascinated in graphs as I am. So this is, you can do this by keeping nature notes for a year or longer. Just keep a note of what you see and how many you see, and suddenly the natural world becomes much more interesting. So this is a year of 2 Rye Harbour ducks, and the lower one is a numerous duck. Look, it goes up to 300 on the left-hand side there, and it's obviously a winter duck. So can you see what it is yet? The top one is very different. It's a duck that only occurs in very small numbers, and it's only from spring through to autumn that it occurs here. So any thoughts yet? So the lower one is the teal, and this is a bird of shallow wetlands and especially salt marshes, and it's done really well here in the last few years, good numbers of them. The other one is a similar looking bird, the gargany, which used to be called the summer teal. So these are closely related birds, and they have very different strategies. And we're very fortunate to now have enough wetland habitat at Castle Water that encourages 1 or 2 pairs to stay each year, and in some years they nest successfully. So the year of a typical bird looks a bit like this. So during the winter months, birds are just trying to survive, and then as spring arrives, some of them will molt their feathers. They will all put on fat and body condition, so that most of them will then migrate through the spring. They'll then breed, And then as soon as they finish breeding, they have to molt all their feathers again. It's a huge amount of protein required, and that's why birds finish breeding so early in the year, because they have to put a lot of effort into molting. Then they'll be fattening up again, and then they'll be migrating to their winter. So most birds are migratory, and they exploit temporary abundance of food, and they're avoiding harsh weather. And don't forget that many insects and fish migrate as well. So I've tried to create a black-headed gull year. Some of our black-headed gulls go down to Spain and have been seen on rubbish tips near Madrid. So perhaps they're there now thinking about coming back. They've still got their winter plumage. The feathers on their head are mostly showing pale, but the tips will wear away to reveal the chocolate brown head and the lovely crescent white around the eye. And this gets them ready for coming back to their nesting islands at Rye Harbour, defending territory, pairing up perhaps with their mate from last year. And then by the end of April, beginning of May, they'll be laying 2 or 3 eggs, closely packed together in colonies on islands. And then in May, the eggs should hatch if all goes well. The little chicks are very cute. And then they take another month and they become a little bit more ugly. And then they turn into the very strange looking juveniles that you rarely see illustrated in books. And then the adults will molt again before they go back to Spain. So for the many birds, it's a really tough year of endless effort to survive and fatten and migrate and molt and migrate. But other animals have different strategies. So, and often they're a lot simpler. So here's a 7-spot ladybird, very obviously a 7-spot ladybird for most of the year. But in the spring, they lay their eggs and then they develop into very weird looking larvae. And at all stages, they're a friend of gardeners. They're eating greenfly as fast as they can. And different plants have different strategies. So at this time of year in January, you'll be hard pressed to go and find any sign of these pyramidal orchids with lady's bedstraw. But there's a circle of the year, and most of the plants are dormant at the moment, but with milder weather, they'll all be bursting out soon. So this is what we think of as winter, but it's not often like this at Rye Harbour. We've yet to have any snow this year. This is the closest we got to it on the 10th of January. It was very, very frosty and looked very pretty, but no snow here yet. And that's good news for many of our wetland birds that are busily trying to find enough food to survive. So why do they come here? Well, on this map of Europe, the last place you want to live or stay in the winter, if you're a wetland bird, is the blue and green areas, because the water will become frozen. So birds fly to the nice warm yellow areas from Greenland and Iceland, from Scandinavia, and from Russia and Central Europe, all heading towards Rye Harbour. So in Britain, we're very mild, and in Sussex, we're even milder. It may not feel like it much of the time, but look, here at Rye Harbour, we're bright red, which means it's 5 to 6 degrees centigrade as an average January temperature. So all these birds have a great time sunbathing and relaxing in the mild weather. So in this image, there's coot and tufted duck and teal and gadwall and mallard and widgeon. And I just want to focus in on the widgeon. So here we are, a very similar graph to the teal. And we have such large numbers that I wonder whether widgeon are the sound of Rye Harbour in winter. So a whistling widgeon. They're a dabbling duck and they pair up during the winter, and a few of the pairs specialise on stealing the food of coots. The coots dive down and bring up the waterweed from deeper water, and the widgeons share their diet. So other dabbling ducks are gadwall and pintail and shoveler and the teal, and during the winter months they are looking their best. Most of them by now in January will have paired up. The male's dazzling plumage will have impressed the female, and they'll hang about together. Then there's another group of ducks, the diving ducks. This is the pochard and the familiar tufted ducks, and the less common but very similar looking scaup and the goldeneye. And these ducks are getting their food from the deeper gravel pits, and they can be frustrating to watch because sometimes they spend more time under the water than bobbing about on top. So it's not just the ducks that come to us, the wading birds come to us as well. So the curlew and the lapwing and the golden plover are really after just one thing: big juicy earthworms. And the earthworms are only available to these birds if the ground is not frozen. So it's really important that these birds spend the winter in places where the ground is not going to freeze. Golden plovers feed mostly at night. So for bird watchers, the large roosting flocks of golden plover in the day are quite a spectacle. The curlew have a different strategy, and they feed by day. Their longer beaks mean they can probe down to catch the earthworms. I should have said that at night the earthworms come to the surface, so that's why the golden plovers with their short beaks feed at night. So every evening the curlew come into roost either at the new salt marsh near the Discovery Centre or on the saline lagoons near the lifeboat house. But here's a problem. So when the ground does freeze, the lapwing and the golden plover and the curlew have got to decide, are they going to hang around and use up their fat stores, or are they going to fly south and flee the weather? And hard weather, cold weather, freezing weather is a big problem for populations of these wading birds. And February is the start of the breeding season for many species, and they have to put up with the possibility of icy weather and snowy weather. And these are cormorants nesting in the trees at Castle Water, and some of them are already incubating by middle of February. They are fabulous looking birds, and in this plumage, the iridescence on their backs really shows how they're a primitive bird. You can almost imagine them being a little dinosaur nesting in the trees. Another bird that starts really early and must lay eggs in February are the ravens. This is a new breeding bird to the reserve, and last year by the 23rd of April 3 large chicks were ready to leave their nest. So there are a few flowers in March, but this first one, the common whitlow grass, often starts in February. A very small white flower. Then we get the coltsfoot flowers, the flowers emerging before the leaves. And then the tiny, tiny white flowers of scurvy grass and the little blue flowers of early forget-me-not. Those little blue flowers there are only about 2 millimeters across. So here's a close-up of a little forget-me-not flower in all its glory. A very valuable early flowering plant is the grey willow or sallow. And here a common tortoiseshell is getting some vital food on a nice sunny day. But have you thought about willow trees? They have a strange flowering pattern in that some plants are male. So here's a male flower. And these are the anthers as they're developing. And they're producing the pollen. And then there are female flowers that have to be pollinated to later produce all the fluffy seeds. And there are 2 types of plant, males and females. And there's a very special word that's not much good in Scrabble. It's dioecious. It's a term for having separate male and female plants. So by the beginning of March, the black-headed gulls would have come back from Spain, and they'll be starting to set up territories on our saline lagoons. And it's really important that we have finished all our maintenance of the hides and the fences and the islands by the time they come back. And here they are on the islands in March, and in recent years they've been joined at the back there by the gulls that have proper black heads, the Mediterranean gulls. So the Mediterranean gulls have become another sound of spring. It'll only be another couple of weeks before we start hearing that mewing call. And they have very distinctive white wingtips as well. But if you notice on this bird, its red legs have got a white colour ring on, and a large proportion of the Mediterranean gull population have been ringed abroad or in this country. And if you can photograph or note down through a telescope what the numbers are, it gives you a fascinating insight into the personal histories of these birds. This one had travelled a long way, 806 kilometres from its birthplace, and it had been on many exciting trips around Europe before it got to us. This used to be an anxiously awaited sound of spring, the northern wheatear. So it's about the 5th of March that we start thinking of seeing the first wheatears. And we're hanging on to a very small isolated breeding population. I think last year we had just half a dozen pairs. So in the next week or so, we'll be cleaning out their nest boxes to give them the best chance of being successful when they do come back. In some springs, we get huge numbers of sandwich terns very early in the season. They seem to use Ternary Pool as a base from which to go fishing to rebuild up their fat reserves to start their breeding. We didn't get so many last year. And then another favourite sound of spring is the lapwing. Now this isn't a single photograph, this is a composite. And you're supposed to start up here top left and follow a spiral round and imagine calling. You can see some of them are flying upside down, and they're really spectacular to watch, but we've not been successful in capturing their display flight in video, so this little photo composite will have to do for now. It's another breeding bird that we're just hanging on to. There's very few places in Sussex and the south of England where lapwing are doing well. We've got about a dozen pairs, and what we'd really like to see is more of these. This wet, muddy habitat is ideal for lapwing chicks. They need to feed constantly in order to grow, and it's quite a battle in some years maintaining enough habitat for these birds to do well. Another sound of spring is the yodeling of the redshank when they're displaying. And then in the salt marsh areas, we now regularly have avocet, and you can see from the graph in the top right that just any day now, any day soon, numbers will start to increase as they come back from their wintering grounds. They may have spent the winter in France or down in the West Country on the estuaries there. And it's still hard to remember that they are such a recent colonist to Sussex, and they've occupied all of the available habitat. They've been so successful in their first years that they often now are fighting with each other, and they're fighting with redshanks and shelducks for the limited amount of muddy habitat that's ideal for their chicks to grow up and fledge. Here's another wading bird. This is the nest of a ringed plover. This will be an eyesight test. So to help you out, here they are. Here's the eggs in the middle. And the ringed plover relies upon camouflage. When any danger approaches, the ringed plovers will creep off. Sometimes they'll do their broken wing display, and then they'll creep back. So I hope you can see the eggs in the foreground. And here's the female ringed plover coming back and settling down on those eggs, keeping all four of them warm with her brood patch, where she's lost the feathers so that the eggs can have contact with her hot skin. And they're doing okay here at Rye Harbour. We've got about 30 pairs, and these wading birds are struggling throughout Britain, and it's by having our electric fencing and the managing of the water levels on some of the pools that we're able to maintain these populations, just about maintain them. So here we are. These are the ringed plovers nesting, marching up and down in their territories, and there's our defence against foxes and badgers. And hopefully the electric wires on the top will stop the foxes climbing over, and the electric wire on the bottom will stop both of these mammals from tunnelling under. And hopefully the numbers of plovers will increase. So this is the last refuge for many of these ground nesting birds in Sussex and in the south of England. So we're trying to recreate a coastal habitat which was very difficult for foxes and badgers to live on. But with drainage and improvements to sea defences, the foxes and the badgers can live very closely to these vulnerable nesting birds. So the fence is very expensive. It's very time consuming to look after, but it's the only way, the only practical way we are going to maintain all these breeding birds. So I suppose the real sound of spring in mid-April is this one. And we're still holding on to our cuckoos. When they've disappeared from much of the countryside around, we still have a reasonable number. And I think the reason is we have a good variety and population, good choice of hairy caterpillars. And as you can see from the left-hand photo, cuckoos are a specialist of hairy caterpillars. So here's the brown-tailed moth that have overwintered in their webs. And by the time the cuckoos come back in the middle of April, the caterpillars, the hairy caterpillars, have grown up, they've eaten the brambles, they've got big and fat and juicy, and they're ideal cuckoo food. And later in the year, in August, the adult moths will appear and lay their eggs again. There's this other big hairy caterpillar, sometimes about 2 inches long, which the cuckoos love, and they often fly out onto the beach in the evening when I suspect the caterpillars are roaming around a bit more. But this is a very rare caterpillar, a very rare moth, the pale grass egger, and it's only known from Dungeness and Rye Harbour. And the large moth adult again comes out in August. So by the spring, the brown reed beds are turning into green reed beds, and they come alive with the sounds of birds. Oh, that was the wrong one. So the birds that live in the reed beds can be very frustrating because they often remain hidden. But all those fabulous sounds can be heard now at Castle Water. I don't mean now, I mean in April and May, because of all the reed bed creation work we've done and the maintenance that we do to keep that habitat ideal for all these birds. So moving on to summer. The beach becomes very colourful, the pink thrift and the blue viper's bugloss. But to me, the sound of the beach in summer is not seabirds at all. It's this bird. So let's have a closer look at the viper's bugloss. It's a very large plant and it has a long flowering season, and it's very good for insects. It produces lots of nectar. So viper relates to snakes. So there will be images of snakes in a moment, just by that yellow sign. So look away now if you don't like snakes. The flowers come from a rosette of leaves that each are long and shaped like an ox's tongue. So it gets part of its name from Bugloss, ox tongue. But what about the viper's name? When the flower stalks are unfurling, do they look like a viper rearing up? Or when you look at the blotchy stems, do they look like a snake's skin? Or when you look at the tiny little seeds, do they look like the triangular head of a viper? This seed on the left looks the most convincing to me. But the reason for calling it vipers, the one that I like the most, is about having a forked tongue. The stigma, the female part of the flower, is divided at the end. And I think it looks like a snake because of that. It's a fabulous plant for insects. It's long flowering season. It produces flower after flower after flower and masses of nectar. It's not good for pollen, but the insects with long tongues, like this common carder bee, can get a lot of energy from these plants, as can the hummingbird hawk moth with its unbelievably long tongue hovering in front of the flowers. And there's a very rare weevil that's known from 50 UK sites in Britain, and it specialises, can only live and survive on Viper's bugloss. So if we can look after the Viper's bugloss, we'll look after the weevil. What a fabulous plant. Another iconic plant of the shingle is sea kale. In late May and early June, it produces masses of flowers. Little creamy flowers that turn into globular seeds that then, when they mature, they break off as a stem and they float out to sea and find a new beach wherever the wind takes them. And then they die off during the winter. And if the tides expose their roots, they're not going to do very well. And then they'll sprout again. And this is in a couple of weeks' time, they'll be at this stage. And then they'll sprout their purple leaves, and off we go again with the green leaves. The sea pea, another scarce shingle plant, very much like a sweet pea, its flower. It has a pod like a pea, and there's a lot of life in the pods. If you open a pod, invariably you'll see some of the seeds have holes in them, and that's where a little beetle has emerged. But the beetle doesn't have it all to its own, because there's also a wasp that lays its eggs on some of the larvae of the beetles. So there's a whole life in the pod of sea pea. Another distinctive shingle plant is the yellow horn poppy. Fantastic flowers that sometimes, when there's lots of pollen beetles around, there'll be hundreds of them in each flower head. And when the seed pods mature, if you look closely, and if the goldfinches don't get there first, there'll be all these tightly packed seeds with lovely sculptured surfaces in there. And the yellow horn poppy has its own very rare weevil, which is known from just 8 sites in the UK. And the weevil lives down in the old roots, in the hollow roots of the yellow horn poppy. Sea campion has made a comeback in the last few years after being nibbled almost to death by rabbits. And again, it's got lovely sculptured, kidney-shaped seeds. And I wonder why they're like that. So in the past, rabbits have had a big impact on our flowering plants, and we've constructed these fences to keep them away from the flowering plants. And it's been really successful in getting back stinking hawksbeard, a plant that was declared extinct in Britain in the 1980s, was reintroduced to Rye Harbour and Dungeness, and last year we had 30,000 plants. And the fences have been good for our other very rare plant, the least lettuce, another rare plant, the narrow-leaved hemp nettle. And living on this rare plant is this rare beetle. It's a flea beetle, and it's only known from 5 UK sites. So if we're looking after these plants, we're looking after the beetles as well. We've nurtured wild carrot, and the last couple of years we've had Sussex emerald moths regularly recorded. We haven't found their caterpillars yet, but we're going to have another good search for them this summer. But we've had so many adults that they must be breeding locally. So summer's the time when the sandwich terns and the common terns and the little terns should be producing their chicks, but the terns are in trouble. There's a sort of crisis for them. In recent years, they haven't been catching very many of these fish, ideally sand eels. The common terns are more flexible and they've gone inland, and this one's called a freshwater perch. But perhaps there is some hope. In 2017, this huge area of the coast, of the sea, 424 square kilometres, was declared a special protection area. And here we are at Rye Harbour. And it was designed to be the distance that sandwich terns would go to feed. But in practice, it hasn't made any difference. But I hope it will. So as the birds' breeding season comes to an end, or when most birds are still breeding, the lapwings are already molting their feathers, and many lapwings come to Rye Harbour to feed and grow their feathers, and they come back in June, and they've come from far and wide. And then a little bit later, the curlew come back to molt. And if you see these birds with symmetrical notches in their wings, it's where they're molting their feathers. They can only do a few at a time because they've got to be able to fly. Inland at the Castle Water wetland in summer, there's a whole host of wetland plants. This is water mint, fantastic for nectar for insects, bumblebees, and this painted lady butterfly. But the arrow's pointing to a problem for these wetland plants. The same for marsh pennywort. There's this little plant with tiny white flowers that's causing a problem. And for this very rare lesser water plantain, you can see this plant is smothering them. It's called Australian swampweed or New Zealand pygmy weed. The scientific name is Crassula helmsii, and we discovered it about 2005 at Castle Water, and it is destroying a lot of wetland wildlife interest. But there is hope. Biocontrol in the form of a mite may be the solution, but it's been developed for many years, and I just wonder when are we going to get the opportunity to control this invasive weed with the little mite. So in the Castle Water wetland, in the slightly drier areas, we've got these lovely orchids, marsh helleborine. We originally knew them from just one site on Rye Harbour Farm, but they've got to Castle Water under their own steam, and that is through these tiny, tiny little seeds, only about 1.5 millimeters long, and they're so light they can blow about in the wind. And you can see from these seed pods at the bottom here, they produce masses and masses of seed. So the wind at Rye Harbour is helping to spread the marsh helleborines to our new wetland areas. Another wetland plant, but this time we've had to encourage it, the marshmallow. We harvest the seeds from the few plants we had 20 years ago, and with the help of volunteers and schools, we've propagated them and we've planted them out, not just because the plant itself is scarce, but because of this moth, the marshmallow moth. It is a moth that's only found in about 3 places in the UK, and after 15 years of growing these marshmallow plants, we now have the moth at Castlewater. So we've also been working in the summer trying to improve the grassland and make them more flowery. This area was arable land up until 2002, and we've encouraged it to become a really flower-rich meadow habitat, and that's been aimed principally at helping bumblebees and other pollinators. And in the autumn we'll have work parties. Well, hopefully in the autumn we can have work parties. We'll cut the flowery parts of the grassland and we'll spread the hay as green hay, and in that is all the seeds, and in this way we can speed up the recovery of the grassland. One plant we're not helping at all, and it's just doing its own thing, is autumn lady's tresses, a tiny little orchid, perhaps only 3 or 4 inches tall, and the flowers are tiny, but they are worth getting down and having a close look at. It's a favourite autumn plant of mine because it took me many years to work out how to find them. And on the salt marsh we have a lot of late flowering plants. The sea aster is similar to Michaelmas daisy and grows about the same time. It has 2 different types of flower. It has the classic daisy flower with the longer ray florets, the petals, and then there's this other variety which lacks those longer petals. But both types are attractive to insects, and one insect in particular is the sea aster bee, which lives in the upper salt marsh and digs tunnels and waterproofs the tunnels with a type of cellophane it produces. And then later in the year, the sea aster produces masses of fluffy seeds that get spread by the wind to new areas of salt marsh, but they are a favourite of the ducks, especially teal in the autumn. Here's an almost invisible flower of the upper salt marsh called slender hare's ear. It's a real challenge to find it, and often I think when you've gone to all that trouble to find it, it's not a great thing, but it needs our help, and hopefully our new salt marsh habitat will be ideal for this species to spread. Here's a plant that needs no help at all. It's an invader from Sicily, been brought here by man, and it's spreading rapidly near the red-roofed hut. But it does provide a lot of nectar for insects, and it also produces seeds for skylarks in the winter, and in December it was the main food that the shorelark that visited us was using. Very similar plant in a similar location, but this is a native. This is sea heath, a plant that got from the Mediterranean to Rye Harbour under its own steam. Delicate little petals. Now I'm just rushing through this a bit because I realise I'm up to 50 minutes already, so I hope you're still all awake. We've done a lot of work creating salt marsh, and it's rapidly improved. And if you just concentrate on the little circles, so there we are in 2017, not very much of the sea purslane. It's increasing, and last year it's increased a lot. So this upper salt marsh habitat is really the home of many special plants, not least the sea barley, which looks like the barley that you might be familiar with grown as a crop, but it's barely 3 inches tall. And we've got a couple of patches of this, and it's increasing year on year. We hear a lot in the autumn about the amazing changing colours of our woodlands, but let's not overlook the changing salt marsh colours. It's quite a spectacle, but you have to catch it in the right light. This very quickly is our story of the Nethusiast pipistrelle. By catching them and marking them, experts have discovered that they migrate a long way, and there are 2 that relate to Rye. One flew from Latvia up here all the way down to Rye, and another one flew from Rye to Brussels. And we're learning a lot about this by putting metal rings on them, and there's the possibility of tiny little transmitters that might help scientists to find out more. So in the autumn, we can have lovely calm evenings like this at Castle Water, and quick sound of bats. But then we can rapidly turn into stormy weather with spectacular seas. And after storms in the autumn, we get great gatherings of gulls, because they've come to feed on all the poor little animals that have been washed up. And last year we had an enormous wreck of these very large sand gapers. That's my size 9 foot. There's a lot of meat there for gulls and foxes and badgers. And last week we had a wreck of starfish, and sometimes we get these sea potatoes. But my favorite animal to discover on the beach are these weird little worms called sea mouses. I don't know how to say it, but they have iridescent little bristles along their side. So the storms move an awful lot of shingle. You can see in this photograph there's little individual pebbles that are getting tossed along. They tend to move with the southwesterly winds. So they're all moving down towards the river mouth, where the Environment Agency put them into lorries and then take them to pet level, where they release the stones to come back on the longshore drift. But it's this road that makes Rye Harbour Nature Reserve so good, so easy for visitors, for cycling and for walking. And in our last year of counting, our estimating, it was about 400,000 visits in 2019. So there we are. That's a year at Rye Harbour. We often have spectacular sunsets, but this was a sunrise from a couple of days ago. So I want to thank you for your support, especially if you're a volunteer or a friend of Rye Harbour Nature Reserve or a member of the Sussex Wildlife Trust. In your way, you're supporting the work that we can do to make Rye Harbour a special place for people and for wildlife.
Barry, so I was caught me out there. I was so enjoying that. Thank you very much. That was absolutely fantastic. I'm sure everyone will agree. There was so much amazing wildlife, some great photos and lovely comments from people, of course, praising your photography, Barry. And so is there time for a few questions?
Yes, please.
Okay, well, lots of questions. I picked, I grouped some together. Anyway, there's a few questions about climate change from Mel, from Chris, from Jane and Jackie. They want to know, how is climate change affecting Rye Harbour and the wildlife at Rye Harbour?
So we've had some new wildlife colonise in the last few years. Little egrets are probably one of the best examples. And it's partly because we get so few hard winters that little egrets have been able to colonise and start breeding. They're in good condition. I saw one the other morning that had the most amazing breeding plumes already. Hopefully I'll be able to get a photo or video of it, because it's reliably in the same place each morning. but gradually birds are colonizing. So we've had the colonization of Chetty's warblers, a warbler that's with us all year round. So they need just slightly milder weather to survive. Insects can colonize much more rapidly, and we've had some dragonflies appear for the first time. Southern migrant hawkers have appeared in the last 2 years, and yeah, so it's a gradual process, year on year, and it's only by counting and identifying the species that we can track the changes.
Okay, thank you. There's what we got here. Tony asked, have the peregrines that you see at Camber Castle ever nested at Rye Harbour?
They have. They've raised young in a couple of years, but they've been the peregrines ousted the barn owls, and the peregrines have now been ousted by the ravens. All birds that are fabulous. 20 years ago we wouldn't have thought of having peregrines or ravens, but there we go. Some birds are changing rapidly.
Speaking about nesting birds, Barry, there's a few questions about wheatears. That seemed to prompt a few questions. Now, Richard and Mel said, what is causing the declines in wheatears? And Tricia and Marion both asked, what does a wheatear nest box look like, and where do you put it?
Okay, wheatears nest underground, and they will nest under bits of old rubbish on the beach. Apparently they used to use ammunition cases when they were out there after the Second World War. But they're very vulnerable to ground predators. So we can keep out foxes and badgers, but they're also vulnerable to stoats and weasels. So it's a real struggle for wheatears to have a good breeding season. The nest box, they will nest in rabbit burrows, but the nest boxes that we put out are tubes about 60 centimeters long. Sometimes we use old drain pipes. Yeah, just trying to create a cavity underground, but it's impossible to make a wheatear nest box that isn't vulnerable to stoats.
Well, that's the last question. Now, this is asked by quite a few people. They want to know, how is the visitor centre progressing and when will it be open?
It's progressing very well. It's looking very good. I'm hoping that the hoardings will come down in a month or so, and that the footpath will be fully reopened. We're obviously having difficulties with the COVID pandemic, but we're looking towards an opening end of April or May, but nothing is certain these days.
That's very true, Barry, very true. Well, Barry, thank you again for that. Just